We're exploring the difference between systemic investing versus investing in systems. And we've done the breakout. One of the statements that I've loved all of my life is a difference is only a difference if it makes a difference. So, what is the difference between these two? Why does it matter? Now, for some people, there might not be any difference. They might be using the word systemic investing and the words investing in systems to point at the same thing. Then there's no difference. But for other people, there is a difference, and they may not even be aware of the difference. One of the biggest differences that I see is that, first of all, the whole concept of a system is such a broad concept. The word system can point at so many different things, and not all of them are what we actually need to be working on. And I'll come to that in a moment. Secondly, a key difference that I see is that systemic investing is emphasizing, to my mind, how investing is done versus investing in systems, to my mind, emphasizes the nature of the system itself, where investing is then a consequence of rather than the primary thing. And one of the reasons I think this is important, Amber, for example, has given a few very good talks that I've heard over the past few months, talking about the risk of system washing, regen washing, all of that. And she's identified some of the classic patterns that the existing paradigm has used to defuse what the emerging new paradigm is trying to do with the words, co-opt those words in a way that ends up preserving the existing paradigm. And so I have a concern that if we don't get clear on the difference between systemic investing and investing in systems, we have a very real risk of repeating the patterns that we've seen time and again in the past that have taken green to greenwashing, SDG to SDG washing, that have led to the triple bottom line being recalled by John Elkington, and that I'm seeing right now in the whole regenerative space. The same patterns I fear are leading to regen washing and to system washing. So this is why I think it matters, and why I think that there is a difference that makes a difference. So building off the Cynefin framework, we can think of systems as coming into at least four different categories. We have simple systems, which is like a Lego kit, in particular, a predefined Lego kit, where there is only one right answer on how to put the Lego pieces together. Then you have complicated systems, which are like, for example, an intricate clockwork mechanism. It's very finicky. It's very easy to break. It's maybe very difficult to repair, but you can get all of the information you need to get the system to work perfectly. But then you have complex systems like a natural ecosystem, which are where you cannot get all of the information you need. You cannot control it. You cannot make things happen. All you can do is create the conditions to allow the system or to support the system to emerge and unfold as best it can, given the rapidly changing context and everything. And then you have chaotic systems like a forest fire, where you really can't predict what's going to happen. It's highly, highly dependent on good luck, bad luck, uncontrollables, unpredictables. So these are the four this is one categorization of systems into four types. And this is where I think that difference between systemic investing and investing in systems makes a big difference. A lot of what I'm hearing from the systemic investing community is looking at systemic investing, and I'm hearing the kind of language I would hear for simple or complicated. Whereas the kind of systems that can lead to a regenerative economy, that can lead to an economy that works for all living entities on the planet, that can only be a complex system. So we need to be really clear when we're talking about systems, which of these four categories are we talking about? And then it gets a little bit more subtle, even within the complex systems, which is what we're normally dealing with in reality. So the central question is, what delivers our intention? And if our intention is right on the right-hand side to build a fully regenerative economy, one where we're building an anti-fragile or a regenerative ecosystem, which can also be called a complex adaptive system in biology, there we need a number of things to be in place. A lot of what we have today, at best, in our current economy is a complex maladaptive system. It's a fragile system. And so again, this is the risk, or part of the risk, when we think of systemic investing. It's very easy to think that you're doing perfect systemic investing without realizing that your investment system is investing in a complex maladaptive system. In other words, what you're doing is actually upholding the current economic paradigm rather than creating a new paradigm. And the difference can sometimes be very difficult to see. Then on the other side, getting even more degenerative, you might have something that people call a system, but actually it's what I would call a constellation. It's like a constellation of stars. They look as if they're close together. They look as if they have something to do with each other, but they may be so far apart that the interaction between them is really negligible. Platforms are sometimes like that, and you may have no system at all. Now, one of the key things in here, so one of the key characteristics of the kind of regenerative ecosystem or complex adaptive system that we need to have a regenerative economy is a very high degree of circularity and high coupling in all of the different exchanges of value, be it financial currencies, non-financial currencies, or any other kind of value exchange. There needs to be a high degree of circularity in that, not just circularity in the material layer, but also circularity in the financial layer. And we'll see in a little bit just how big a difference it makes if you build a truly complex adaptive system with high coupling strength rather than a complex maladaptive system, let alone a constellation. So, characteristics of the kind of complex adaptive system that we ought to be investing in. And to be clear here, in what I've just shown, that slide and this slide, my focus is on creating the system that we will then invest in. So it's system-led rather than investment-led. One of the key necessary characteristics is that it's in full alignment with the laws of nature, things like the laws of thermodynamics, For those who've heard the word before, the laws of ergodicity, and I'll unpack that a bit more in a moment. And you can well imagine anything that is contradicting the laws of thermodynamics is not going to last for very long. And this is a key problem we have with our current economy. Our economy is not respecting the laws of thermodynamics. In particular, one of the key laws, which is energy balancing, the amount of energy that we're using to power our civilization is just not in balance. Um, I won't say more about that. Another one that is really important, if you look in any natural ecosystem, any natural complex adaptive system, like life on Earth, which has been functioning for 4.7 billion years, one of the key characteristics of any living being is that it has full agency. Every single living being has decision authority to decide what it does with its life, what it does with its resources, who it gets into what kind of a relationship with. And the lack of this characteristic in today's economy is one of the reasons why we have a complex maladaptive system in our economy rather than a complex adaptive system. Namely, even though company law allows for companies to have full agency, we often end up incorporating them in such a way that we take away their agency. And this is one of the issues I'm seeing emerging in an attempt to get away from the limitations of the standard investor primacy limited company. People are moving to alternative ownership models, like, for example, nonprofit or charitable entities, say a 501c3 in the US. And the problem there is those are still de-identified. You're still taking away agency from the actual company as a living being in the complex adaptive system. And this prevents it from really being part of a system with the characteristics needed for it to be regenerative. So this full agency is a key one. Resource pooling, this is critical. And we've already touched on the necessity to have, in a system that is going to be regenerative, pooling over not just money, but all other types of capitals and currencies. A consequence of these two, pooling and agency, it needs to have control over internal resources and flow. And that means it also needs to have some level of control over the capital investments and other kinds of funding streams coming into it. And this is a key thing that I'm saying. The investors, the funders, are not outside the system in a complex adaptive system. It needs to have the capacity for internal learning and to adapt, and it needs to be able to adapt at the speed of change. It also needs to have the capacity for autopoiesis. In other words, the capacity to self-organize, self-direct, and reproduce itself. If any of these are missing, it's at best going to be a weak complex adaptive system, but most likely complex maladaptive. So one of the things that I have found really helpful in getting to grips with what I'm talking about is we need to develop our capacity to think and to be able to go beyond binary logic. I'm not going to go into detail on this, but to really be able to see a complex adaptive system, all of the different aspects of it, we need to develop fluidity in seeing structures and context, which is static time independent. We need to be able to develop our capacity to see how things flow, processes. We also need to develop our capacity to see how things are in relationship to each other. One of the key thought forms inside here, for example, is recognizing the value of bringing into relationship. And this is one of the types of thinking that we're not seeing enough of, is what is the value of creating new types of relationship within the system, between systems. And then the fourth one, which depends on these first three, are transformational thought forms. In other words, recognizing that maybe if you build in another two types of relationship, bring in another two types of structures, and add a bit of a new kind of process, what you might end up with is, because of emergence, something that is actually completely different to what you had before. In other words, it is transforming like a caterpillar to a butterfly. And that's something that, again, I find is missing from a lot of the thinking and dialogue I'm hearing around systemic investing, is this recognition that if you set up the right relatedness structures, processes, or maybe not set up the right ones, but you create the context for structures, processes, relationships to emerge in response to what's happening, then you can actually have a massive transformation, in particular transformation from complex maladaptive to complex adaptive systems. So here's a comparison. I ran just before the call a simulation using our systemic financial planning software of two different approaches to the same companies, 10 companies. I ran the simulation once with the 10 companies as an uncoupled system. In other words, as a standard portfolio, a portfolio of 10 companies that have no connection, no interaction with each other. And then I ran it again, exactly the same companies, where I had a very strong coupling between the companies. And you can see the difference. In the uncoupled system, the likelihood of the companies surviving to the end was only 10%. In the strongly coupled system, it was greater than 95%. The chances of hitting or exceeding a 3x multiplier for the initial investment after 20 years was only 7% in the uncoupled system and 70% in the strongly coupled system. And the relative median financial health, in other words, how healthy was the company's bank balance at the end of 20 years, in the strongly coupled system, it was 370 times bigger. That means you have basically 370 times more money that you can use to do regenerative outcomes than if you do not have the strong coupling. And this is only a simple simulation looking only at the financial side, strong coupling in the financials. If you bring in all of the other things that you brought in at the beginning, the multiple currencies, the possibility, as Paolo and Stefan brought in, of having multiplier complementary currencies and all of the other things, these numbers can get significantly better even. Now, if you want to play with the planner, you can go over there and register. I will shift over it to at the moment. So what you'll see is, let me just go back to the dashboard. What you'll see once you get in is a library of templates. You can import these into your working area and just play with them. And what I've just been showing you are numbers coming from this capital simulation, which has in it This is one of the standard templates, 10 different companies. Each of them is functioning like an investment vehicle. It only has capital growth. And what you get out of it is results. You can choose how many years you want to run over. You can choose your target multiplier, and you get out of it 3 different graphs. This first one is what normal financial planning tells you, and this is ignoring the laws of nature, in particular, ignoring the benefits of collaboration and pooling. You get, then, I just need to run that again. You then get this ergodicity correction. That is correcting for losses caused by something I've covered in previous webinars called ergodicity versus non-ergodicity. Basically, normal business ignores this. It's ignoring the laws of physics. And the outcome is modern day economics and business theory is blind to the power of cooperation, blind to the power of capital pooling, blind to the difference between a complex adaptive system and a complex maladaptive system. And the big difference, if I look at now 499 equally likely paths over 10 years without the ergodicity correction, you see over 10 years, the likelihood of hitting the 3x target is 13%. If I extended it up to 20 years, it would be about that 7%. But if I switch on the ergodicity correction, in other words, if each of the 10 companies in this ecosystem pools their profit at the end of each month, then the outcome changes dramatically. The likelihood of hitting the 3x target is now 48% rather than 13%, and it gets even better the longer it runs. So this is something, there are a couple of videos on YouTube from the last webinars we held going much deeper into this. You're welcome to play with it, and you're welcome to come to us and ask questions, or and contact Julia, and I'll put that up in a moment. So to close off and then move into discussion, I would say we need both. We need to systemically invest in systems. The system we invest in is paramount. We need to create the conditions for complex adaptive systems to be the kinds of systems we invest in. And only a complex adaptive system can be regenerative. We need to then invest systemically in these systems. And one of the key things, to my mind, of investing systemically is recognizing that the investor is a part of the system. They may be part of multiple systems, but they're not independent. So for everybody who wants more, sign up for the next 2 webinars, the one on the 9th of September and one on the 7th of October. Julia is the person to contact for more information on our offerings for investors and for entrepreneurs, by the way, across the full spectrum. For example, with some people, we're already using the planner to help them get a handle on just how big a benefit it would be to shift from a portfolio approach with uncoupled companies into a more ecosystemic approach with coupled companies, and stepping towards forming a complex adaptive system. The final thought I'll leave is an economy that fails some will eventually fail all. And this is the problem of the economy we have. It's a complex maladaptive system. That means it's structured systemically to lead to a few winners and many losers over a long enough period of time. And the evidence is absolutely clear. with that kind of complex maladaptive system, eventually everybody loses. So lots more about what we're up to, YouTube, LinkedIn, and in these two books. That's where you can contact us.